Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode of Boys in the Cave. My name is Tanzim, your host for today. And alhamdulillah, I'm joined by someone very special today. So I'm joined by Ustadh Mohammed Artan, who is a videographer, student of Islamic disciple. That sounds like Jesus' disciple. Student of Islamic discipline, publisher and historian. He's the founder and managing director of Looh Press, a publishing company specializing in Islamic, African and Somali studies resources. He studied and continues to study with wide range of scholars and historians, and his interest intersects with Islamic studies, Islam in East Africa and ancient East African history. So, Assalamu alaikum Ustadh Mohammed Artan, and welcome to Boys in the Cave.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and thank you for having me.
Anytime. We were talking in the car, and then because Malik from Mizan Avenue hooked me up, but I actually was aware of the event that was happening in Melbourne. What was the title of the conference?
Forgotten Legacy.
Forgotten Legacy. And I knew there was someone there that was discussing African studies, but I forgot it was you specifically. I forgot the name. I don't actually remember names that well. But alhamdulillah, we were able to make that connection. So I'm actually very excited for this episode, because I don't know what your experiences have been, but especially in the West, I feel that Africa and Islam, there's not enough discussion about these two particular subject areas in depth, because I don't know what the situation is. I feel that we're more Arab dominated sort of Islam, in the sense that we only see Islam through how Arabs may have seen it, but in other regions of the world, like even in India or Bangladesh or Pakistan, in historically, and also in Africa, we aren't as much as aware compared to maybe other areas of the world. So what do you think about that?
Well, it is true. It is, in a sense, seen as some sort of an alien component when African history is being discussed. So Islam is seen like an alien component, or a recent phenomena, or something that has happened maybe just before colonialism. So it's around about maybe 17th, 18th century, like that. So in a light of historical works that are produced nowadays, many of these work revolve around how Muslims express themselves during the colonial period, for example, the colonial struggle, for example, freedom movements, and all these things, and the turuqs and tasawwuf and the Sufi scholars, and how then the madrasas and manuscripts come about, and the knowledge of the Arabic language. So all of that is somewhat discussed around about 17th, 18th, 19th century period, and this creates the thinking or the psyche that Islam is sort of a new identity within the African continent.
Subhanallah. But I wanted to actually ask you, because there's, in terms of Islam, I know that in history, like for example, even though Musa alayhi salam may not have had the Quran revealed to him at that time, it was like the Torah. At the same time, however, we know that there were revelations come down, and for those specific people at that specific time, they would have been called Muslims because they're worshipping one God, and they have a scripture in the Quran, revelation. Would you say that in Africa we had that situation where perhaps because we know even during the time of Musa alayhi salam, and he was in Egypt, and we know Egypt is close with all the other African countries as well, could there have been perhaps maybe a scripture that came down that in those areas where they would have been deemed as Muslim, but they were following different scripture, and could be traced back historically, so it would have been like an ancient sort of...
So there's no way of denying that could have happened or not happened, but there are actually instances. For example, if you look at the cultures and the histories and the oral history of certain ethnicities in Africa, what they nowadays call traditional African religions, for example. And a lot of those religions, or these point of views, or these theologies, are built on a premises of monotheism. So monotheism is quite big in terms of many northern African ethnicities. So to give you an example, we know from the Somali experience, as well as the ethnicities known as the Oromo, Afar, and these are a group of people that live in Northeast Africa. So basically what we call today Ethiopia, Somali, Djibouti, these type of lands, right? And so we know from these people and their languages and their religious expression, that they are completely based on monotheism.
Yeah.
Okay, and so there is no sort of an idol worship.
And what time period would have this been?
So we're talking about ancient period here. So round about the Pharaoh periods, the Pharaonic periods, as well as the pre-Christian period. So BCE basically.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, these cultures are there. They have these identities. They have these expressions. They have this language, heritage, and these religious rituals that all somewhat correlate and fit in well within the Islamic guidelines, within the Islamic rules. So there, in essence, there are no idols. There are no what is it called? There are no worship of ancestry. There are no worship of inanimate objects. Okay, the concept of God is an all-being, all-aware, all-powerful, not present on earth, but obviously somewhere above the heavens. Is a concept that we know today in theology.
Even in like most religions around the world, there's always this concept of a higher, like they may do shirk in the sense that there's lower gods and stuff, but there's always that one God above them all.
So there is no demigod in that sense. With the idea that I was just describing, there are no demigods. There are no smaller gods. There are no intermediate beings in that sense. So all of it is a pure theological premise that is designed on the God of the sky in essence, the God of the heavens, the God who is above us. So all these are the anecdotes and the stories that we have from these cultures on Northeast Africa and the Horn generally.
And what do you think was, because when we look, me growing up in the West, we see as Africa, they were just tribe people, and I don't know, they were in the jungles and there was no real kingdoms, and that's how we've been taught to view Africa, especially in history classes here in the West, right? But you're actually expressing that no, there was a worship of one God back in the ancient times, but how we are portrayed as Africa is that they are, I think it's called animism, where they worship worship animal spirits as well, something along those lines. So what's the time? Like,
and
what's
totems
the actual,
and all these things.
Yeah. So when did that even come before the worship of monotheism in Africa? Was that after? Like, because the lines are a bit blurred. You get what I mean?
Yeah.
So what do you think?
Africa is a huge continent, and it has quite a lot of people from different backgrounds in there, and so it's very hard to say a statement and then judge it based on everybody and everybody's experience. So that's not going to be possible. So there's certain cultures that would have an sort of an animism religious view. They would have totems. They would have probably idols. They would worship ancestry. All of these things are there, right? But there are also cultures and societies that do not have that at all. Okay, there are cultures that do magic. There are cultures who actually work in terms of trying to express themselves. They use these elements, right? But the overwhelming information that we have from prehistory and the times of ancient times is that for the most of the people in Africa, they were very open to monotheism. That's why when Islam comes to the continent, and especially if the indigenous people took on Islam, it spread like a wildfire. Subhanallah. And that already shows you that you can identify with things that you're familiar with. You will disassociate with things that you cannot relate to, right?
Yeah.
And so people found it the familiarity with the Tawheed, the familiarity of this simple way of life, of having this beautiful social conduct or social norms, is to say, okay, now this is the religion that makes sense. In a sense of trading, in a sense of politics, in a sense of culture. And for most of the people who actually received Islam, they found it fit very well with their traditional view of life. Because Islam let you culturally be you.
Yeah.
Okay, it only adjusted the theological premises that might contradict it. So that's why you see the African experience in the Islamic experience in Africa quite different to anywhere else. For example, you'll see the dress code for men, you'll see the dress code for women, you see the infrastructure and how they build masjids. All of these things are quite unique to the African continent, but not so. And we start seeing recent times that everything becomes a uniformity, but before it wasn't like that.
SubhanAllah. And I do want to touch on, because we know through the Sirah, like King Najashi from Abyssinia, that would have been like modern day Ethiopia, I assume, right?
Yeah.
And we know that when the Muslims went to him, we know he died as a Muslim, and Rasul Sallallahu did the janazah from the distance. And however, when the Muslims went to him, we know that he was actually receptive to the message. So it kind of, you kind of mentioning that it gelled with Islam, gelled with the African culture. We kind of also see that through the Sirah when Najashi was open. I think he was a secret kind of, I don't know if he wasn't explicitly a Muslim that he announced himself in that sense. I think he was like keeping it to himself. But it shows that back then as well, during the time of Rasulullah, Islam wasn't like a foreign idea. Like when the Muslims came, like, oh, get out of here, they were actually talking about Isa alayhi salam and making those parallels, because Najashi was Christian as well, right? And I assume even if you take Najashi and the people that came before him, like how long was Christianity in Africa as well in that time period? Because we see as Christianity only being associated with the West, and we know at that time it would have been going through the time, when Isa alayhi salam was around, that the areas of like Palestine and all that, there would have been Christianity then as well. But when do you think that it reached to Africa and became, I assume because Najashi was Christian and he was the king, it was embedded in the African society. So
there was African tribes and African peoples who already have been a Christian predominantly. So like, for example, the Berbers, quite a section of the Berbers in North Africa. You know the Berbers. Yeah. They've been Christian for a while. And then
could you just explain Berbers for the audience, like listeners?
Yeah, so Berbers are people who live in North Africa, what we now know as Morocco, Algeria, Tunis, Maghreb generally. They're traditional people who have always lived in just around the Sahara, so the African Sahara.
Was Ibn Battuta a Berber as well, from memory?
Yeah, he hailed from a Berber background in terms of tribe, but he wasn't predominantly Arab Berber.
Okay.
So there is a distinctive between those two. But yeah, so these people lived that part of the world, and they're the ones that actually helped spread Islam when the companions came to North Africa and they embraced Islam. And what we mentioned earlier on, that when the indigenous embrace Islam and they take ownership to it, and they become part of the hierarchy, they start spreading Islam to their family and tribes and everything. But coming back to your question about Christianity in Africa, you had that element of Christians in Africa, but then also you had the Christians who were the Egyptians and in the Coptic environment, as you might know. And this is when Amr ibn As radiallahu anhu comes to Egypt and conquer, and they're the ones that actually help him gain foot in Egypt, and in terms of his conquest again and spreading Islam and going all the way to Sudan and South Sudan. That could have only been possible if the people that were local to that helped them and that knew the geography and the landscape. But also then there are Christians that have been in what we know as Northeast Africa, so Ethiopia, Eritrea, and these modern states that we have. So the Najash is one of them. It's been documented and said that around about 3rd century, around about that time, 2nd, 3rd century period, that's when the Ethiopian kingdom became Christian in essence. And this is an ancient kingdom that used to be called an Aksum Empire. And so the Aksum Empire, in essence, controlled what we called Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, some portions of what we know as Somalia now, Yemen, South Yemen, in the entirety of South Yemen. So all of these areas are the areas that they've controlled and held sway over, and they were Christians at the time. And so it's much later that Christianity and the rule of Christianity deteriorates, and at that time when Islam comes to the scene is when everything else sort of goes out the window. And that's sort of the period of the time of Ashab al-Fil, when the Prophet ﷺ was born.
Subhanallah. And people don't know, like, story of the elephant, essentially, when Allah saved the Kaaba, essentially. So that happened around the time of what you were mentioning about the kingdoms in...
Yeah, so around that time of when obviously the way I'll start at the end. The Prophet ﷺ gets a revelation of Surah Al-Fil, okay? Which is Alam tara kayfa fa'ala rabbuka bi ashabil fil. Have you not seen what your Lord has done to the people of the elephant? And this is a narrative that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to, not that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was there, because he was born the year after, right? And so it's a rhetorical question in the sense that, this is what we've done. And so the lesson that is learned from this narrative, and why this lesson is being told decades later in Mecca, is to tell the Meccans who were alive in essence at the time, who have a recent memory of that experience, that look, this is what your Lord done in favor for you. And whole army came from South Yemen with elephants that you've never seen, huge elephants with trunks and everything, and they came to, in essence, conquer you. And the Arabs who were indigenous to that area, the Hijaz, essentially, as well as the people of the Prophet ﷺ background, his family, his father, they give up essence. We know from the Seerah that they leave Mecca. They leave Mecca because they cannot face this army, and the question becomes then, how should we defend ourselves? Well, let us defend our wealth and material well-being, and let God, or Allah in this essence, defend his house, is the Kaaba. And this is essentially what has happened between that dialogue of Abraha and Abdul Muttalib.
SubhanAllah. In terms of, because you mentioned Egypt a bit before, I wanted to ask you, in terms of Egypt, because when we study Egypt, especially in the West, we get this impression that Egyptians were a lot more light-skinned, not exactly black, but not exactly white either, somewhere in the middle. And they had, because they, we see the Sphinx, the pyramids, and the big kingdoms that they had, and the tombs, and Tutankhamun and all that. We tend to associate Egypt not with Africa. We tend to see it as a kind of separate entity, but obviously when you look in the world map, it's in Africa, right? However, we don't associate those sort of big nations. They seemed affluent in nature because you need a lot of money to build the sort of stuff that they did, I assume, right? Even, during the story of Musa alayhi salam, that was the case as well, the people of Egypt. At the same time, with your sort of research, are you aware of the same sort of kingdoms that were in other places in Africa, not just only in Egypt? Because if hypothetically saying, if a civilization like that existed in Egypt, which is in Africa, perhaps there were just the similar civilizations that had the same amount of power also in different parts of Africa that we may not know about. So what's your sort of take on that?
There are quite a few empires that were around just I assume you're talking about just before Islam came to the scene.
And before Islam, because that's the ancient. That would be like, even like in Egypt, that's like way before Islam came as well. So you had Carthage, for example, to give you an example, modern day Tunis or modern day Tunisia. These are empires that have been there and have ruled that part of the world, and they held sway over the trade networks that were there. And these were essentially Africans. And Hannibal. What was his name? Basically a general by the name of Hannibal. Have you heard of him before? He was a Roman.
Yeah. He was a Carthaginian in essence. He came from North Africa, what we would today call the Berbers in essence. And he is the one that has that famous trek with, again, elephants crossing the Iberian Peninsula, invading Rome through the Alps. Okay, who does that? Through the Alps.
I've heard. Were there Roman accounts of this? I remember reading something like they were attacked by big elephants. I don't know if it's the.
It is. That's the account that we have, and so it goes through that, and so it is. Yeah, there are empires and dynasties that were around at that time and way later and during Islam and after Islam, and all of that has been the norm for any cultures and societies. They're bound to develop civilizations. They're bound to develop a system of hierarchy and ruling and economy. It's just made such a way that today, that in our psyche, when we think of Africa, we just think of an exotic animal, safari, these are the things, nice weather, these are the things that we think of. We don't think of a continent which is inhabited by people, people who had needs just like anybody else.
SubhanAllah. And what would you say, because Islam kind of came into the picture, in regards to the ruling, the group that you mentioned, with the civilizations, what sort of religion did they ascribe to?
So it depends. There are kind of different
The elephant
periods.
one that you mentioned, the one into Rome?
The Carthaginians.
The Carthaginians,
yeah. So they as far as we know, they were just people who followed traditional religions. Some of them followed just like, at the time, philosophical ideas on the nature of God and who is God and what God. So there was no a system based on what we know as today as a religion, or this religion or that religion. But they had a philosophical idea of God and what it means to worship God and these sort of ideas. But and this is true with all the ancient civilizations. And the same thing goes with for the Greeks. Same thing goes for the Romans. When you philosophize about God and the nature of God, you tend to develop things that go either with your philosophy or things that you think you can control the masses on in terms of philosophizing. That's why they have the demigods in a sense. How you talk about Zeus, you talk about Thor, and all these demigods are there because that's the prevalent culture of the society.
That reminds me, because I'm more familiar with the subcontinent, and I know when the colonialists, when the Europeans came and colonized India, what happened at that time when they came in was that what we deem as Hinduism now, there was no actual name given to the religion, because when you actually look into Hinduism, there's so many different sects, like so many different parts of the world. I know,
and these are traditions.
Yeah, exactly. Like Rabindranath Tagore, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was like a famous poet that I think he was from the Bengal area. He was Hindu as well, but his type of Hinduism was there was no, you weren't permitted to worship idols, like statues. So it would be more in line with like monotheism without actually calling it like Islam. So you have different factions of Hinduism in that sense. But when the colonialists came, they didn't give it a name. They didn't even call it Hinduism. What the colonialists did, they actually they called them Hinduism and just grouped them all together. They kind of grouped Islam in the same fashion as well. Because they were just like, okay, we're not going to spend much time in giving thought about the nuances. So it's going to group everyone together.
It is interesting.
So that kind of reminds me, I think it's like a similar mode where if you take it in face value, like even with the Hindu religion, some people will say that we were talking before about shirk and there's a higher god involved, and however, yes, they do associate idols, but there in most traditions there is like a higher god which you would call Allah, right?
Yeah, and
there's varieties on that within the Hindu religion, and we would say that perhaps with those scriptures there was actual wahi, like revelation from God, Some people might say like Krishna, for example, may have been a prophet, or what happened was that the scripture got transmitted wrong. There was errors and mistakes people added to it, and can't be reliable. So all these stories that were legitimate were essentially were corrupted over time. So that kind of reminds me, like, it's kind of a similar mode. And I feel that with how we view religion now, like even I guess Islam, like you don't have to necessarily, like, obviously if you're believing, like from our theology would say that Musa alayhi salam was practicing Islam, even though it wasn't, they didn't call it Islam, but we know it's Islam, right? Because it's
Hanif. Yeah.
Hanif, exactly. Yeah. So it's like the similar kind of mode, I guess, in vibe what you get in Africa as well.
Yeah, this is so we that anecdote, the example I just gave earlier on in terms of East Africa and the expression of God, the unity of God, the monotheism of the nature of God. It's the traditions can be seen in different ethnicities and with different groups. So you see the same tradition, you see the same type of names, you see the same type of acts, you see the same type of expression around how to worship God. And these people are completely people who lived in different geographies. They're people who actually have a different language. They're people who might share a proximity, but in everything else, they have nothing to do with each other, right? And so, like, to give you an example, in the memory, in terms of language and linguistics, we know something called waq in Somali, right? And waq is a word to describe God. Now, we now use Allah, because that's the word that we describe God with, right? We don't describe God with waq now. We use Allah. And so in essence, what people believed those days can be seen in our language. So for example, if we wanted to say pray to God, for example, or prayers or dua in a sense, we would say dehwaq. There's two words, right? Dehwaq, call on to God. Okay, call on to God or make dua in that sense. And so that is that has been a tradition where now you can see that into the Somali language, but then you move on and you go and see another group or set of people who have different language, different experience, and you say similar thing, or you explain to them that this notion means this with the Somalis. They say, yeah, this means similarly to us. We probably say it slightly differently. So like, and you will see that across the East African part of the continent, and I find it really interesting that now the same word that I just told you, dehwaq, is used in the form of shouting. So now the word it's become the waq, and we say like, oh, this guy is shouting at you, and he's shouting, and this guy is screaming or whatever. And so the word that was called to God has changed somewhat, and it became a form of now shouting. Probably, I don't know, people used to be in a plane somewhat and making dua so loud. It is just transferred. So yeah, this is the expressions that we have. I'll give you another example. When we talk about praying salah, you know, the salah that we are prescribed to pray in Somali, we don't say salah. We say salah, and everybody understands the salah because that's an Arabic word, that's in the Quran, that's in Hadith. But in our word that we use to describe prayers or salah is tuko or tukasho. And the funny thing is that word is linked with a name of the bird that's called the crow. You know, the black crow, that bird. That bird is literally what the Somalis call tukosh. And that bird does that sound that we know when it's crying, wak, 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 wak. And so we're talking about that bird and what it does, and people seeing that as a sort of a reminder that it's time to pray salah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and because the same thing as many
cultures. Was this the Somali people? Like they would know from the
ancient, yeah. So in a pre-Islam period and stuff. And so this is when Islam then comes and says we pray 5 times prayers, and this is what it is. we worship a God that's not found within yourselves. It's not found on a statue. We say that just like the verses of the Quran, that God is above us. God is not incarnate within us. Okay, all these things and all these ideas and all these premises are not really far-fetched to what you believe in. So you adapt that and you spread that, and then people accept it even more. And that's been the tradition with many African cultures, and others have not been that way. So I can't lump everything together in essence, basically.
That reminds me that's a good idea. Like the sense of, I guess, the two aspects. Like there's language where you'll see Islamic values embedded in all certain languages already. Like when Islam comes and they encounter aspects of Islam, they already see that through their language, through things that they're already saying. There's already Islamic values embedded into that. And I think that's a kind of deep topic. I think that gets into like linguistics, and perhaps because we know through the Arabic language, it's a pure language, and that's why it was revelation was done through Arabic specifically. And we know the Arabs were very good with poetry, the masters of that time. Even with secular academics now, they would say that the Arabs of that time were essentially like the best in poetry of like in history potentially, right? And at the same time, there's also the Semitic languages.
We contest that, by the way.
Oh, really?
That they were the best poets.
Oh, okay.
We're the best poets. I'm just joking. Yeah, go on.
And there's the Semitic languages that are seen to be portrayed as the pure languages, where there was other revelations that came down, like we know, Bible, Torah, etc. And they were done through those languages because they were the pure languages as well. But however, there could be even other languages, and it seems like maybe African languages that are being used that maybe are in the same time period as those languages. And since perhaps through language, through pure language, you will already have, what do you call it, like an essence of worshipping God, like a belief, a Hanif belief already. So when it gets passed down, you can communicate it, I guess, through your language already. And when Islam comes, you just say, yeah, it makes sense because it's already in your language. And the second part is like the fitra. I feel that people already are inherently, like, I believe it's truth. It's objective truth, right? Like people already inherently believe in worshipping a God. Like you don't have to, what I've realized as well, you don't really have to go into, God is XYZ. Like you don't have to sit them down in an Aqidah class and explain everything. Like obviously there's a time and place for that, but when people say God, they'll know like what you're referring to, like the higher power. We can't see him and all that. So, and that when you're communicating that through Islam to people in, I assume during when Islam was spreading to Africa as well, and you're communicating that it's nothing foreign. It's like, yeah, we have it might be slightly different to what they're currently doing at that time, but it's a similar sort of thing. So they just kind of slightly mold it. They're just like, yeah, that's Islam, and it's nothing too foreign. You know what I mean?
You take ownership to what you understand and what you can relate to, right? And this is what historically has always worked for people. So if you come to a new people or a new land and you come with your foreign ideas and you come with your foreign language and you come with your foreign culture and your foreign religion, for example, people take all this foreign, they take and put them together, all of that, and then they'll take and accept the things that can actually relate to them. Okay, so if you come with a better ethics and moral sense of a business acumen, then the people will adopt that because there is fairness into it, and that's why a lot of people around the globe, not only Africans but many people around the globe, accepted Islam through that. Because Muslims came, traded with them, and they, in essence, embodied the deen that they understood. Okay, the fairness, or what do they call, fair trade aspect of it. And so when people come there, and the idea is not to hoard, and the idea is not to overcharge, the idea is not to charge interest, take all of your wealth and all of these things, and the idea is based on fairness, then people will take that and then it will take ownership of it and it will relate to that, and then maybe
it's part of the fitra. It'll appeal to them straight off the bat, like these principles. Like even just a real life example. I remember, like, I had a friend. He was a non-Muslim, but when he saw Muslims, they don't gamble, they can't drink, they can't do haram, they can't go clubbing. Like, it's for the fit. They know it's the right thing to do. Then the nafs will tell them to be like, nah, I want to do X, Y, Z. But if a person is being sincere, and which my friend was, and if he sees that, he's like, yeah, that makes sense. Like, they know straight away it makes sense. Like, it's kind of what you're talking about as well, like business principles. If you know it's fair, you know, like, not taking riba is like, it's a good thing, you know what I mean? So if you embodying that through Islam, people will understand. It will make sense.
Yeah, and these were and this is what they say in hindsight, that the majority of the people who accepted Islam throughout the globe historically have accepted Islam through traders. People who came and settled with them and traded and sort of wanted, give or take. And the give or take was not only monetary. What people have been taken was their religion. And these guys did not know that's what they've been given. They thought they've been giving a product and material that they came to trade with. Okay? But in essence, what people saw were their akhlaq, their mannerism, their ethics, and the code of conduct. And they took that, and that is where the take was in for them.
There was like I think from the top of my memory, there's a hadith where it's like Allah will raise the honest businessmen with the martyrs on the Day of Judgment. So I think, like, in that sense, I've taken that as inspiration, because I had like a side business I was doing. I don't know yourself, you do a side business with selling books. It's like there's a lot of, through businesses, Allah's blessed, I guess, business in general, because you're relying on His rizq, and if you're honest in how you conduct, there's a lot of barakah in that as well. So I guess that's another wisdom of why Allah has made things in a way where through trade in the past would have spread the message of Islam. So it's a pretty deep topic. It's all interconnected. Like, I think the hadith is there in that sense to push people to do business, and Allah's kind of willed it in a way where it can spread Islam as well.
Because what comes from trade and business?
Like
wealth.
Benefit, money,
wealth, right?
Yeah.
No, that's a primary thing, wealth. And haram wealth and halal wealth, how does that affect people?
Like in the akhirah? Or even in the dunya as well?
In the dunya I'm talking about. How does that affect? It affects us physically, it affects us mentally, right? And so a lot of the times what we don't understand is when we consume haram, for example. There are things that we do not see that basically become as a consequence of us consuming haram.
That's so true. A lot of scholars talked about this. I think Imam Nawawi, I think his father wasn't practicing. I forgot which scholar. I think it was Imam Nawawi, where he said that the one thing that his father ensured that he did, even though he wasn't a practicing person, was that he would feed his family with halal wealth, and made a priority over that. And that's how Imam Nawawi turned out. So we see, like, on a metaphysical sense, we don't really see the effects of halal and haram wealth, but it's there. It's there.
And this is something that was his own wara', his own cautiousness. And the Imam Nawawi was known to have, skipped the for example, the grapes. For example, people would bring him grapes and he would not eat it. And these are based on his own understanding that they were not based on an halal sort of farming, because it's known back in the day.
Taqwa is like, wow.
Yeah, back in the day, at the time of the Imam Nawawi, the leaders were taking lands forcefully, and so when they take lands forcefully and they sell it or they grow things, a lot of the material that as a consequence ends up in the market and people buy are from there. Now, naturally, you would say, do I really need to investigate that long? Do I have to really go into that depth about where things come from, haram and halal wise? No, you don't. But if you have the knowledge and the background, if you know the where certain things are coming from and the doubt element in there, you should just avoid from it. And this is how you maintain a barakah. And I was asking one of my sheikh a while ago, I said, I travel abroad a lot and I come back from home or Africa or a lot of these countries where we consider it as a developing countries or countries that are poor. And I find myself in a sense of having enough time, having been able to,
well.
yeah. So when you're there and you want to do a business or you're doing something and you're moving around, you'll find that the day has enough hours for you to do what you needed to do, right?
Oh, really? Wow.
You find that you eat food much better, so you get a nice appetite. Maybe it's the weather, I don't know. And then you find yourself that you live a bit more healthier and stuff, And I was like, I was thinking, and then you just come and in my case to UK, and I'm running around, I'm trying to do something that I've done in a day over there, I'm trying to do it here in a week, and I'm having barely the time to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, and I don't have the bed. And then I find that sleep is sufficient. I sleep early, wake up early. Here I can sleep maybe 10 to 11 hours and not feel rested out, things like that. And you're always consuming here. There's a lot of food and there's a lot of waste and all that stuff. And so I was asking Sheikh Ali, by the name Sheikh Ali Laraki, he's based in Leicester. And he said it is the barakah in the air, is the barakah in the food, and is the barakah in your time. Because when you have a barakah that filters a lot of things, there is a fruit in what you do. Okay, so if there is a barakah that filters your halal, what you eat is halal and everything else, then there is a barakah that filters the air that you breathe in, for example, because people are praying there, people are doing the adhan there and everything. There's a barakah on the soil because it's literally a sijaya. That's where everybody prays, and everybody is literally, when salat starts, people stop randomly, and you don't go to the nearest masjid because the nearest masjid might be next door but might be a bit distant, so people just stop anywhere and then pray. And so that's the sijaya, that's the prayer mat. So these are things that purify our wealth, purify our sustenance, improve our times, and these things we don't have enough of in here. Because why? The haram is a lot. And I'm not talking about, in essence, the haram within the Muslims. We're talking about communities that we live within, right? The riba is a lot. The trade networks and the divide between rich and poor. Obviously, the same thing happens back home and stuff. But in essence, a lot of things that we shouldn't have been able to easily accept is acceptable. And so that the barakah in it becomes less or none. So the more da'wah you do, the more self-discipline you have, the more wara' you have, the more barakah there is for you when you're in an environment where there is no barakah. So that's how it works. If you're in an environment that have less barakah, you need to make sure that you find yourself, that you create barakah within what you do, within your own enclosure. So you pray your salah, you pray your tahajjud, all these things. But anyway, I divert. And this is some of the things that the scholars talked about. Subhanallah.
I do want to ask. That was good tangent, mashallah, about barakah. I think, that's a very deep topic to get into. But I do want to ask you. I know I asked you in the car as well, but about Rasulullah's skin complexion. Why I bring it up is that, firstly, we know that Saudi Arabia is not far from Africa anyway, there's the Red Sea and you're literally there. There's Egypt as well. And at the same time, why I bring it up is that in our modern day, we see Arabs, right? They aren't exactly white in color, but they're obviously not black either. So we tend to associate Arabs of this day and age as looking similar to what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have looked in those times, because he was Arab as well. And however, from my sort of readings, what I've come to know is that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was more of a pure Arab, and pure Arabs are more African rather than the sort of Arabs we see now, because the Arabs we see now, they're a lot lighter in skin color compared to Africans, because during the times of the Khilafah, Rashidun, and even afterwards, when there was a lot of intermingling between the Muslim countries. Obviously, I don't know, Syrians married Lebanese, and there have been like mixing in that sense. So that's why the lighter skin complexion came into play, right? But if you go back in time, we'll actually know that perhaps, and you can probably elaborate on this, is that Rasulullah would have been looking more African, perhaps, than your kind of modern day Arab, or maybe not. I don't know. But what's your take?
The modern day society has this obsession with color, skin color. You know, this is
colonialism. That's why
it's just crazy. And I
was watching sorry to cut you, but reason you bring I wanted to add is that I watched this I think it was a like a 5-minute documentary. It's like the millions of dollars that are spent in India to get people to have fairer skin complexion. There's like these weird there's these tools that they use that they kind of kill your pigmentation for like 24 hours, 48 hours, just so you're lighter, and you get darker the next day. So that's how crazy it is, right? But I think it's like the colonialism plays a big part just around the world. And then
the other side of the world is like how much rich people pay to get a tan. right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
So it's crazy. Like, how much do you think that the average rich person, a white rich person I'm talking about here, pays to get a tan?
I don't know the prices. I don't really go, so I wouldn't know.
It's ridiculous amount of money. They go through weird treatments so that they can have that beautiful tan, that perfect tan. And then people on the other side of the world go to the extreme to become lighter.
Yeah.
You know. So the skin issue and the skin color issue is something that I really don't sit still and ponder about. But it is an issue that is out there. It is an issue around identity. It is an issue around how does one perceive someone if they are that skin color one way or the other. So, like, for example, when you ask the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam skin color, and the skin color that Adam, as well as Musa alayhi salam, and various others of the Anbiya have been related and transmitted, was closer to the shade that is dark.
Yeah, and Musa alayhi salam will explicitly, because in the hadith of when Rasulullah went, when Isra Miraj, we went into the heavens and he met all the prophets. I think Musa alayhi salam, he had described the skin complexions of the prophets to his Sahaba. He described Musa alayhi salam to be like darker complexion. I can't remember the other ones, but
and why shouldn't it? Why shouldn't it? Did you look at the historical example here? Forget the skin color for a bit. He's been generations, I don't know exactly how many generations, but for at least 4 or 5 generations of living in Egypt, right?
Yeah, of course.
Egypt is what?
It's in Africa.
Is a black society, right?
Yeah.
Or a somewhat darker society, whether you want to call it Nubian society, whether you want to call it brown skin color society. So all of this was there, and these people, especially the Bani Israel, who've come in the time of Nabiullah Yusuf alayhi salam, because you have to start the story at the beginning when Ibrahim alayhi salam comes in Egypt, and he gets he comes in Egypt with Sahra, and then he gets Hajra. Okay, Hajra, who is somewhat a princess in custody, as it were, because you have to understand the historical background to how Hajra became part of that household of the pharaoh at the time. Okay, and so the pharaoh, that pharaoh at the time was in constant conflict with the Nubian pharaohs, because you had the Sudani pharaohs and then you had the Egyptian pharaohs, what we call the Egyptian pharaohs.
Was this around the time Musa?
This is just before the time of Musa. Ibrahim alayhi salam.
Ibrahim alayhi salam. Okay.
Yeah, so we're talking about around 5,000-6,000 years back. Okay, and so these are the times that these people were in conflict with one another. Now, what do people do traditionally when you want to suss and put a conflict to bed? You kind of wed people that are related to you. Your son would wed with your opposition's daughter and vice versa, so that, there's not going to be an issue anymore.
Yeah.
So back in the day, what they used to do is also they used to take royalty to stay with the other king. So they used to raise them as their own.
Okay.
And this is the context where Hajra comes into her life. So Hajra comes from a royal family. Her father is one of the kings at the time of Sudan, the Pharaoh Sudan, and he actually lost these sort of battles. And in essence, basically, she becomes a princess in captivity. Okay, I'll put that in brackets, because in essence, he is raising her as his protectee, right?
And I know some Christians, they use derogatory, like Hajar being like a slave, like in a derogatory manner, to discredit Ibrahim.
This is in the narrative. Yeah, it's even within the Muslim records and within the Muslim traditions. We have that essence where people say, "Oh, Hajra was a slave; she was given to Ibrahim alayhi salam."
Yeah.
Okay, and these are based on what we call Israeliyat, i.e., narratives that are inherited from the Bani Israel, the discussions and the historical account of the Bani Israel. All right, but in essence, so what that king does to make sure that Ibrahim leaves his kingdom, because what the king wants Sahara as his wife, right? You remember this story?
Yeah.
So
you refresh.
That king, he was a king who liked beautiful women.
Okay.
Sarah was a beautiful woman. She and Ibrahim alayhi salam walk into Egypt. They have a bit of deal. If we go into Egypt, there is a king who likes to, forcefully take women who are nice and handsome. Just say we are brothers, so that I do not get killed if you say I'm your husband, or so type of thing, right? So they get into Egypt, and the whole story develops. And this guy, they see Sahara, beautiful. They take her to the king, and when he wants to take her forcefully, she in essence seeks refuge with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he develops some sort of an ability not to be able to move. He can't move. He becomes, what's the medical term when someone becomes
like paralyzed?
Paralyzed, yeah. So he becomes paralyzed, and then he says, "Oh, you bewitched me," or something in that order, and can you just stop what you're doing? And she, and then she makes dua, and then he becomes normal, and then he tries to reach out, and he gets paralyzed. So this has happened several times, and now he's sort of convinced that he does not want her in his environment, right? So he pushes her away, and then he says, "Okay, call your brother, take this woman, and take this woman with you as well, i.e. the Hajra as the princess," right? And so he takes her, and if you know someone that has a wife, you don't give them another woman.
Yeah, like I guess I don't have experience, but I've heard.
It's not like you go around gifting women, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea here is that he was under the impression that this was sort of his sister, and he said, "Okay, you know what? I'm gonna let you have Hajra, who is of royal. She is sort of my how do you say, when you want to become released of an obligation, she becomes the one that sort of releases my obligation from you, which is basically I took this woman and I wanted to basically transgress upon her, and it didn't happen, so take her." And so he takes her, and then they develop that relationship, and she becomes that wife to Ibrahim alayhi salam, and she gets pregnant, and this is when Hajra leaves Palestine, and they move to what is now known as Mecca, known back then as Becca. So they settle there. And when they settle down, the people that come there, the Banu Jurham, the Arabs as they call them, in essence, recognize their authority over the resources that were there, i.e. the well, the water, the Zamzam and stuff. So the story builds on and early on to say that no, Ismail alayhi salam was not born from a mother who was in essence a slave, but from a royalty. okay, and from a black royalty nonetheless, and therefore Ismail himself becomes half black. Okay. Ismail then has that heritage where he's a half black, and then also already the dynamics is such in South Arabia that obviously people intermix and sort of live with one another. And so this is the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ in essence, and the lineage of many of the Qurayshi tribes, and this continues.
SubhanAllah. Do you think that some, I don't know, Jewish or perhaps Christian scholars, do you think they try to discredit Hajar because of that half Sudanese sort of lineage, not half, like full Sudanese like lineage in that sense?
Yeah, it's
make her like, oh, she's a slave, and
it's painting a picture of history that is probably not accurate, and so therefore, and especially if you're on people that faced an exodus, you're not gonna reflect good on the people that kept you in captivity and enslaved you and did all these things. You're gonna reflect them in a bad light, right?
Yeah,
and that's a norm. That's a norm.
SubhanAllah. In terms of even in people would associate, even like we tend to also portray Jewish that are existing in this day and age. They tend to be like white in complexion when we look at them, but because Musa alayhi salam because he's following the Torah, we can probably attribute him to being like Jewish in the quotation marks, by Muslim obviously as well. But
Jewish,
the
Jewish
original
in
Jewish
in heritage, yes.
Yeah, Jewish in heritage. And would you say that original Judaism would have been from Africa?
Right. No, there is obviously the whole immigration, the whole period of when Nabiullah Yusuf's father, is it no, not Yunus. Yusuf's father. How can I forget? Anyway, that's when the time period when they come into Africa, when they come into Egypt, right? Yeah. And they settle. And so that experience, they live there, they become part of the system. For a while, they live there as people who are fruitful, people who labor, people who are part of the system, like we are immigrants. And when you come to a new country, you develop, and people appreciate your skill set and your background, right? And then after that, something develops politically where you're painted as some sort of a scum of the earth. You're painted as people who live on the backs of others, people who are no good, people who steal, people who are lie, people, all these things. That image develops, and that image is that negative image which has been carried with the Jewish people when they went through the Exodus and they crossed the Red Sea in a sense, and going back to the Middle East. Now, I do not see any and by the way, yes, to go back to your question, is a Jewish religion an African religion in essence? I wouldn't say it's an African religion, but it's an African experience because it develops from Egypt. It's revealed in Egypt.
Yep.
The whole migration or the hijrah essentially comes from Egypt, okay? And then it moves on into Palestine and the Middle East, and that's where it sets its roots. So the same thing can be said about Islam, but then reversed. Because the immigration of the Prophet ﷺ companion is to East Africa. They settle there, they live there, they prosper, and then they go back. Okay, but the religion is revealed and the Quran and everything else in the Middle East in that essence. So yeah, in Judaism, in Christianity, and in Islam, in all those three religions, we have a strong African presence and a strong African link. Even with Isa alayhi salam, Jesus, in that essence, there is clear cut in the Bibles that he
Bakka is mentioned. In the Bible extensively. Even
I think Mark in Mark it's mentioned in the fact that when Jesus alayhi salam was born, because the king, the king at the time was looking forward to sort of make sure that no one sort of stays behind with an attribute of Isa alayhi salam, because they kind of forecasted that the Messiah would be born, right?
Yeah.
And so the story is such that Isa, as an infant, alayhi salam, and his mother Maryam and his uncle, they leave Palestine to go to Egypt, right? And so that is there is a link there.
I think even to take a different approach when it comes to linking Egypt, because I was reading, I enjoy reading philosophy, and we know a lot of the philosophy that we have in the Western philosophies, obviously, like Greek philosophy. Then you have, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, etc. And if you actually read their bios, I think from memory, Pythagoras, it was also Plato and Socrates. They all went to Egypt to study, like for a good solid 5-6 years, I think. And I haven't really looked into specifically like if there's details of where exactly they studied in Egypt or who the teachers were. But it was funny because even in that Greek times, they were referencing Egypt, but I don't know how clear cut we know of the details there. But since we know Egypt is, in Africa, and we realize that there was also proper knowledge there to be dispersed among to the world, because then we know that when the Greek philosophers went back to Greek, they obviously were able to write many works and make an impact even to this day, right? But it all kind of stemmed from Egypt at that time, so it shows like how profound that area was at a point in time.
Yeah, Egypt is known as the mother of civilization, mother of cities. That's the name it has, but it's alhamdulillah, it's a long tradition that goes back with cultures and civilizations. Seeing Egypt as a center of a place where people actually could trade and interact with the Africans in essence. But it's not only through Egypt that those experiences become unique, and those experiences are then spread further into Africa, or outside of Africa. Like, for example, when Islam comes to Africa, and in the first century already, in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain, in essence, through whom does Islam go through the Iberian Peninsula? Through Africans, through North Africans. Tariq bin Ziyad, for example, and his conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, invading Spain, developing this Spanish heritage that we know as Cordoba, this beautiful tradition that lasted for 700-800 years.
Africa's obviously very close to Europe as well. In that sense.
Yeah, but that's one element. And then you have the Western African experience of Islam, where, Mansa Musa, when Mansa Musa comes in power, how does he come in power? The king prior abdicates. He literally puts his throne down, and he says, now you take the mantle over. I just fitted about 200 ships with several thousand people and money and everything. I'm going to go to across the Atlantic and go to the Americas. Well, he didn't say I'm going to go to the Americas, but yeah, that was the idea. So crossing the ocean that side to actually, he brought some ulama, he brought some wealth, he brought a lot of this material just to go and
apparently was dropping gold bars and everything along the way.
Yeah,
I think that was building masjids on the way.
That was Mansa, but I'm now reflecting beyond Mansa, for example, and if you have to look at the effect these people have had on other continents, you have to look at the Eastern African tradition and the effect it had on the Indian Ocean. For example, like we were talking about earlier in the car, we're talking about, the African diaspora that were in India, in Gujarat, in Bangladesh, in, what is it called? South India, all these places, and how they stayed there, how they developed these states, this Muslim powerhouse. Like Malik Ambar, for example, was one of them. He was an East African man who was brought to modern day Ahmed. How do you say Ahmed? Ahmed Najah is a city and an area. He was brought there. He was raised there as a soldier. He developed a skill set beyond what was the norm. He became a general. He became the right-hand man of the Sultan or the Sultan at the time. And then he became basically the power behind the Sultan. So now there was so many people around this area that these sultans could not actually live and continue and prosper without the protection of Malik, you know. And Malik had all these African regiments of armies and soldiers and people who was his part of his retinue. And even we have records of kings in Spain, kings in England, kings in Portugal actually talking about him and discussing to send letters for the need of actually training their army, or if he cannot train their army, that he would come down and protect them. Okay, because you know these European fiefdoms were at each other's throat for power, and so you have this huge, huge crossover from all the way to West Europe, and to all the way India. That there is a reputation that within his lifespan that there's actually this has been going on. And so this culture of seeing the African continent as a sort of a place that brings cultures together and connects the rest of the world is something that's undervalued and not looked at.
I've got a question coming in. I wanted to ask, which place did Islam come in to? Which place in East Africa did Islam come into first?
So we can't pinpoint exactly where it was. We know that the companions left a port city near Jeddah, which was the norm. Because there were two if we assess the historical accounts or the historic behavior of crossing that Red Sea Ocean. So if you look at from Hijaz, i.e. Mecca, Medina, you had a port that was near Jeddah, okay? But if you look at Yemen, you had a port that was in Aden. So I don't know whether you can envision in terms of the map, okay? So Aden is way south and Jeddah is sort of way north. So these were the two ports in the Arabian Peninsula that people crossed over from to East Africa, okay? So they say it's logic that the companions, being closely located at the time near Mecca, near Jeddah, would actually cross that border. So when they crossed that port, when they crossed through that port, they would land in what would today be modern day Massawa, which is in Eritrea, that type of place. But also it could have easily been landed in Zeila. And Zeila is a city also in Northeast Africa, which is now currently located in Somalia. And we have a tradition of a mosque there, which is called Mosque of Qiblatain. Do you know the Qiblatain Mosque near Medina? I've
heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I haven't been Hajj or anything
yet.
Make dua though I do, but
inshallah. So there's a mosque called Qiblatain. This is the first mosque the Prophet ﷺ prayed in and was built.
Yeah.
Okay. The Prophet's mosque was not the first mosque. That Qiblatain mosque was the first. And it had two Qibla in essence because that's where people used to pray in, right? So the same thing goes, Quba was the first mosque. The Qiblatain mosque that we're talking about here, that one is in Zeila, in what is called in Northeast Africa, okay? And so they looked at the Qibla to Palestine and a Qibla to Mecca. And both Qiblas actually directed perfectly in line with those 2 points. So the idea is that people were praying and were located there at the time, okay, especially the companions. And so when the Qibla changed down the line, people changed Qibla with it as well. So that shows you already then that early on that Muslims were actually using these places as a sort of a place to settle and spread Islam from.
And how did Islam sort of come into Somalia?
So in the early Hijri period, which we just talked about, and the Najash by the name of Najash means actually in Ge'ez, it means the king of kings, right? The same thing means with Mansa Musa. Mansa means a king, right?
Okay.
Caesar means a king.
Yeah.
All these are titles that illustrate the word king, right? So the Najash at the time that we know in our tradition is known as Ashama, okay? Ashama ibn Abjar, if I'm not mistaken. And so he is the one that embraced Islam, who welcomed the companions and everything else, and who later on died. And the Prophet ﷺ prayed janazah over him, Salatul Janazatul Ghaib, in what was in essence Medina. And so that's how initially the chapter of Islam starts in that part of the world, right? It's much later, about half a century later, 50 years later, that we have the fifth Umayyad caliph by the name of Abdul Malik ibn Marwan. I don't know whether you've heard of him before. So Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was very busy in consolidating his power, because he had a lot of people who was competing with his caliphate, you know. And so they say he was the first one to actually consolidate power under one Khalif. It's been traditions such for the 1400 years that we've had one Khalif or the other here and there competing with one another. But they say Abdul Malik ibn Marwan was one of those who was successful in that regard. So that when that happened, in the process of consolidating his power, many refugees left Iraq, many refugees left Mecca, many refugees left, and they settled in what we know now as Mogadishu type of area, okay, which is in Somalia. And so then what he does is then he sends one of his generals to actually go out and look into if these people that are the refugees are essentially prisoners, people that are running away from his rule, that they're not going to go and sort of build another army and so that they can come back and fight him. You see what I mean? So he sends one of his general to actually investigate, and that general comes and he finds that the Muslims there that are Muslims, you know, a place called Kilwa and a place called Mogadishu, he says they are Muslims, they are willing to obey the Khalif and pay the kharaj or the taxations and everything for the soldiers and everything. And so they go back. So we know through that records and in around about 60 or 75 Hijri that there were already Muslims there. Okay, and learning. And so they developed that. And then we also know what we just talked about earlier on, that Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, you know Hajjaj, right? Yeah, Hajjaj, who doesn't know Hajjaj? Yeah. And Hajjaj ibn Yusuf does a similar thing. He sends his nephew, Muhammad ibn Qasim al-Thaqafi, I don't know whether you know him. He's the one that goes to Pakistan, modern day Pakistan, and conquers Pakistan. Okay, so he sends him as well to look into the situation over there. He goes in and looks at it. There's no rebellion, there's no people fighting, and then he takes and recruits an army, and they go with that army to Pakistan. And there was an Hindu king at the time. Then they sort of fight the Hindu king and basically start managing the affairs of the Muslims over there and spreading Islam further until Muhammad is recalled and is executed, because you know he was related to Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. So in that essence, this is what has happened with that history of East Africa and Islam. And the Abbasids come later, the same thing goes. We know, something called the Zenj Rebellion. The Zenj Rebellion is a group of black Africans or East Africans in that essence that were put forcefully into the marshlands by the Khalif to dry the marshlands in Basra, in essence, you know, because Basra did not exist, it was a marshlands at that time. So they were forcefully put there to dry these marshlands, and labor was very hard and intensive. People would die, just like the transatlantic slavery. So a lot of people were dying on a daily basis, and people got fed up, and then they said, you know what, this is not Islamic, this is not natural, this is not humane. we're just going to make sure that we rise up. They rose up and they fought the opposite kingdom or the dynasty, and they somewhat basically threw over. As a consequence of that, Abbasid kingdom dynasty lasted for a bit longer, but Imam Tabari, he says that if it wasn't for the Zanjar rebellion, the Abbasid dynasty would not been hastened its own demise. So the Muslims are early on. You can see how the roles that they play in terms of I
wanted to also ask you two final questions before we wrap up. But one of them was more to do with Sufism in Africa, because if we analyze towards more the west side of Africa, like Mauritania, Morocco, in this day and age, they seem to have a really big Sufi tradition there. We know with Murabat al-Hajj, late Murabat al-Hajj, there seems to be a scholarship of Sufism in that sense. So from that sort of analysis, I assume that even in places around Africa, there seems to be perhaps a deep Sufi tradition, or maybe it might be more of a perhaps Salafi tradition. I'm not too sure. But would you say there's like a kind of ancient deep Sufi tradition that existed maybe right after the Sahaba or the Khulafa Rashidun were in place, or something along those lines? Do you see that prevalent in Africa?
No, the Sufi tradition is very big and strong in Africa generally, and like every other tradition that have been there on the onset and that spread Islam, there's going to actually have quite a huge number of people that follow it, right? And it as a consequence, then it develops its own distinctive nature, right, and qualities. So this is something that has been there from the get-go. We know that quite a lot of tariqas are of African origin. They based whether you want to call it North African origin, whether you want to call it West African origin, whether you want to call it East African origin. They have these origins and roots in Africa. And obviously, many of the people who...
What, do you know the specific names? Like, I know there's the Chishti Tariqa, there's the Naqshbandi. Would they kind of stem from Africa or not?
No,
really?
I don't think they just say a Naqshbandi would, but in the sense of the Idrisiya, for example, is a Moroccan tradition. For example, the Salihiyya is a sub branch of the Idrisiya, for example. Then you have what we call the Uwaisiyya tariqa, is a sub branch of the Qadiri tariqa, for example. And all of these things are tariqas that come out and develop in essence. The Tijani tariqa, for example, is of an African origin. So you have a lot of tariqas that develop through that tradition and its own, because Islam and the experience of Islam in Africa has been such that people have taken the tradition, they've accepted it, and they've molded based on their own experience.
Yeah.
And so what came out as a consequence was an African tradition. Not much of it is assessed like that. So a lot of the people look at the non-African element of it. They look at like, oh yeah, these guys are converts. They are newcomers to Islam. These type of things. But in reality, it has been there as long as it's been in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, and even some cases longer than any other Arabian Peninsula. Because started in Mecca and then moved into Africa immediately. So we do not look at these traditions, and that's why we say when you look at post-colonial period, that most of the people who were staunch anti-colonial, had an anti-colonial stance, were these mashayikh, these sheikhs of tasawwuf from these African tariqas, who made hell the life of the colonial powers that were there in Africa. They didn't give them reprieve, and this is why you have they call them the Mahdis. They called them the Mahdis. So you had the Somali Mahdi, which was Mohammed we call the Sayyid Mohammed Abdullah Artan, right? And then you had the Libyans. You had Umar, you had Sheikh Abdul Qadir, for example. You know, and so these things, these people are there, and they followed a tariqa here and there, and they promoted that, and they were anti-colonial, and they were very proud of their Islamic heritage and their Islamic traditions.
Alhamdulillah. Yeah, even in we see in India's subcontinent, I guess Islam kind of came through Sufism, more like on the ground dawah / the tariqas that existed there. And I think that's one thing when I've read into...
Sufi is that when it comes to the arrival and the spread of Islam, it's a later stage. The ulama, the Sufi scholars, when they brought Islam, whether it will be the Indian continent or the African continent, has been the first stage, the first wave was migrants and traders.
Yeah, small. Yeah,
there's a chapter there which is conquest, but that's really limited. It's very brief. So then the real number 3 is the mashayikh, the scholars of Tasawwuf and Sufism. They come there and they have a really huge impact on the masses. The others have impact on trade, they have impact on traders, they have impact on rulers, they have impact on people that live on the coastal areas. But the mashayikh go into what is known as the hinterlands. They cover a great distance, they give da'wah. And we have anecdotes of this throughout our history.
Alhamdulillah, yeah, it's definitely a lot of it shows how deep the tradition is when it comes to Sufism spreading into many areas of the Muslim world. Alhamdulillah. I know we've been told to kind of wrap up, but because you gotta talk about you've got a talk at Mizan to do with deliverance from error in the tradition of Tasawwuf, so alhamdulillah for that. But I do want to ask you one final question on Boys in the Cave. It's been really riveting, fascinating discussion about history, and we tied in many elements as well into it. Inshallah, the audience benefits from it. But our final question we usually ask to our guests is, so if you had to pick 3 people in history or anyone that's living currently to hang out with you in a cave, because you know, boys in a cave, like let's pretend this is the cave you're gonna hang out with whoever you want, and it would be interesting because you know you're a historian and all that. 3 people in history, but it can't be Sahaba or Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam because everyone's gonna pick them. Let's just say they're already here chilling with us, and you gotta pick 3 more people in history. Who would they be?
That's interesting. Yeah. So I would definitely have picked Ibn Battuta.
Okay, mashallah.
That is like really up there. The guy, the stuff that he's seen, the lands he's crossed, the experiences he has amassed is just beyond anything that we can take a glimpse of from his work at the Rihla, all right? So I would definitely have chosen Ibn Battuta A. The second guy I would have probably chosen to connect with in a cave was Abdullah al-Zayla'i. He was a scholar from Northeast Africa, what we now know as a Somalia, and hadith scholar and an expert who traveled around the world, but then settled in Cairo and taught many people, as well as wrote the Hanafi hadith work, and so this might relate to you. He was an Hanafi.
Did he permit to eat prawns? Do you know that? I don't know if he'll be accepted in the subcontinent.
I don't know, but his work is widely celebrated and widely accepted as the Taqrij work to have been ever produced. It's called the Nasbaraya, so we talk about that a lot. So I would love to sit down with him, because the scholars, the way they talk about him, they talk about as a man who is very shy, very calm, very quiet, reserved, fair, balanced, you know, well known, and an element of his background that's not widely known is that he left the Northeast Africa, which is now Eritrea, Somaliland or whatever, and he crossed to Cairo to sit down with the Mamluk caliph at the time, and sort of petition for the Muslims in that part of the land where he come from to be assisted in terms of resources, because they were having problems with the Christian empire, and the Muslim dynasties were having a problem. So that's an element that it's not really widely talked about and discussed. And the third person I would have had in my cave would be my father.
SubhanAllah, mashallah. It's a good one.
Yeah.
People, we've had guests forget about their family members, so alhamdulillah, at least
I would have definitely have my father in the cave, just purely for the fact that because he passed away some time ago, and so I have this nostalgic image of what our life was together when he was alive and everything else, and as I grow up and I come across people who he befriended, people who knew him, people who talked about him really warmly and really good about him, I wish I had more time to sort of know what kind of character he was, So you see, people talk about him in a way where you know that your father made an impact on their lives. Is that? Yeah. Quite a few. And he was a simple man. He was not a sheikh. He was not an alim. What I remember from him was in the mornings that he would just have his prayer mat, and he would have his Riyadh al-Salihin there and his mushaf. That's all the religious aspect that I remember from him. It's not overly a religious guy that I can sort of describe, but the character that I've been told about, the personality, the figure that he was, is a person who even strangers who have nothing to gain talking positive about him. Wow. Mentioned these things about him, and so I would consider him a wali, to be honest.
Yeah, it sounds like it. That's what men of God are. They just, people talk good about them, and they live simply in the material and physical sense, but they're able to make impact in other people's lives. Inshallah, may Allah assist us in making us like the character of your father, inshallah.
Ameen.
But Jazakallah khair for coming on Boys in the Cave. It was really
thank you for having me.
Riveting and fantastic episode, because it's a unique episode where we don't get insights into Africa, and it was good that we were tying into not just like in Africa specifically, but we talked about business, barakah, trade, all this sort of stuff. So inshallah, if it was benefit from it, I would love to have you on. I know you're based in the UK, but inshallah in the future we could meet again.
Maybe in the future, inshallah.
Inshallah. I'll definitely plan to go UK one day, so we should definitely link up, inshallah.
Definitely. Jazakallah for having me.
Welcome. So for our listeners, thank you for giving us your attention. If you have any questions or queries, feel free to email us at info@boysinthecave.com or find us on Facebook. You can follow our journey through Instagram. Please leave a 5-star rating on iTunes, as that greatly helps us. And if you want to support our project, and you would have seen we did an episode with Uthman locally at a studio with a high fancy quality equipment. That's like a teaser of what you can see us achieve in a professional sense, So inshallah, you guys, if you have the money to spare, I know a lot of the Muslim community is pretty rich, so they're hiding the money from us. So inshallah, you want to get some good deeds in, definitely go to patreon.com/boysinthecave. Even if it's like $20 a month, $40 a month, $50 a month, that sort of reward accumulates, because you're doing small but consistent efforts, and that'll really help us out with all the funding and upgrading with the equipments, and we're always spending money, so we need your support, inshallah. So from our special guest Ustadh Mohammed and myself, we wish you all the best. This is Tanzim signing off. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam.